Chapter 8 Journey to the Unknown. The first faint light of dawn was brightening the September sky over Spoleto as Father Lachaise and Francis left the house. There was no need to rouse the sleeping household. Preparations had already been made the night before for an early departure. Francis had knelt to receive his father's parting blessing at the end of the family rosary. He had warmly embraced his brothers and had said goodbye to old Pacifica, whose red-rimmed eyes had spoken eloquently of her grief. Without another backward glance, the door was quietly opened and as quietly closed again, and the two travelers slipped down the street toward the waiting coach. Early as it was, other passengers were already in their places, all bound on pilgrimage to Loreto. There was a priest of Spoleto, Father Mario Speranza, and two young students from Rome with their tutor. There was not much room to spare inside the coach, so Father Lachaise and Francis clambered up to the front seat beside the driver, and from this point of vantage prepared to enjoy the trip. Soon the driver cracked his whip. The horses pulled on the straining traces, and the unwieldy coach lurched and rumbled out of Spoleto into the open country. The rising sun scattered the morning mist and gave promise of fair weather for the journey. At first, glances seemed light-hearted and cheerful enough, and chatted freely with his brother and the driver. But when they stopped for lunch, Father Lachaise observed that his younger brother seemed to have lost some of his good spirits, and had also lost his usual healthy appetite. In fact, all through the journey, the Dominican kept a sharp eye on Francis, and his accurate memory has preserved many small details that might otherwise have been lost. Towards evening, his little fit of depression passed off, and he appeared quite happy again. In quotes, "I think," recalled Father Lachaise, "that was because we heard the church bells ringing for the coming feast, and we were able to attend benediction on the last day of the novena in honor of Our Lady of Loreto." End quote. After a night's rest at a country inn, the journey was resumed next morning. Once past Recanati, the travelers eagerly awaited the moment when they would have their first glimpse of the graceful dome of the Basilica of Loreto rising in the distance. Once it came in view, their weariness dropped away, and they anticipated a speedy finish to the journey. But they did not reach Loreto as quickly as they had expected. A sudden storm of tropical violence burst upon them, and the dusty road was quickly turned into a sea of mud. The horses tugged and pulled, the driver cracked his whip, but the heavy coach was hopelessly bogged down. They had to stop to shelter until the storm had abated somewhat, and it was some hours before they could resume their way. It was therefore very late in the evening by the time they arrived at Loreto, and cold, wet, and hungry, stiffly descended from the coach to seek a night's lodging. The unforeseen delay placed havoc with their plans. Loreto was already thronged by an immense crowd of pilgrims, all hoping to take part in the celebration of the feast of Our Lady's Nativity. Father Lachaise and Francis knocked vainly on door after door, seeking accommodation, only to meet with brusque refusal. Finally, after many unsuccessful attempts, the weary brothers gratefully accepted shelter in an already overcrowded inn. The best that the host could offer was a room overlooking the square in front of the basilica. Straw mattresses were set out on the floor, and there perforce they spent a very uncomfortable and almost sleepless night. Impetuous as usual, Francis wanted to visit the basilica at once. With admirable patience, Father Lachaise pointed out that the church was already closed for the night, and there was nothing that they could do about it. He promised that they would both get up very early next morning and be amongst the first to enter. Compelled to stay indoors by the incessant downpour, Francis knelt by the window and looked longingly at the basilica. The square outside was flooded from the torrential rain. Parties of pilgrims sheltered under the open arcades on one side of the basilica. Others, not so fortunate, huddled miserably in groups, wet to the skin, gloomily looking for a break in the clouds. They were not downhearted, however, for from time to time they raised their voices in hymns to the Madonna. At length the rain ceased, and the prudent Father Lachaise decided it would save time next day if they contacted their uncle at once and presented their letter of introduction. But to find the Vicar General of Loreto in the crowded city was no easy task, for this was a busy day for Canon Aquacota. He was not at home, he was not in the church, no one seemed to know where he was. Dusk had fallen when they at last found the canon, who had been out of town to hear the confessions of the nuns at Mount Real. As time pressed, they counted themselves with presenting their letter and gratefully accepted a cordial invitation from the canon to have lunch with him next day. Early next morning, September 8th, Father Lachaise and Francis entered the basilica. Whilst the priest was making his preparations for Mass, Francis joined a queue of penitents waiting to go to confession. To make a complete break with the past, and a spiritual preparation for his new life, Francis made a general confession. It was made with such fervor and thoroughness that never afterwards was there any need to repeat it. He returned to Father Lachaise, served his Mass, and received Holy Communion in the tiny chapel of the Holy House. His thanksgiving was long and fervent. In fact, he would have remained there all day quite happily had not Father Lachaise reminded him of the need to break his fast. For morning coffee, they adjourned to the Jesuit college, where Francis felt himself quite at home and chatted freely with the fathers. On their return from the basilica, the Dominicans suggested that they should both look for a point of vantage where they could assist at the Pontifical High Mass and listen to the singing. Francis replied that he would prefer to remain in the chapel of the Holy House, so with his usual tact, the priest left him to his own devices. He still kept a watchful eye on Francis, however, and continued to record his impressions. He noted that his younger brother had seemed rather downcast at intervals during the previous day. In quotes, "And on that day, too, I expected him to be even more so," he continued, "for we had both suffered a good deal of inconvenience during the night and had no proper sleep. Yet I found the opposite to be the case. After I had finished Mass, I found him kneeling quietly in the corner, completely absorbed in prayer. He seemed quite happy and contented and spent the whole morning in the Holy House." End quote. Francis could simply not tear himself away from the Holy House. The shrine, covered with magnificently carved white marble, stands in lonely isolation in the midst of the basilica. Whilst the exterior is ornate and decorative, the interior retains its primitive simplicity. It is a small, rather dark room, not more than about 30 feet long and about 10 or 12 feet high. Within the shrine, an inspiring inscription confronts the pilgrim. In quotes, "Christian pilgrim, you have here before your eyes the Holy House of Loreto. Here, the most Holy Mary, Mother of God, was born. Here, she was saluted by the angel. Here, the eternal Word of God was made flesh." End quote. Bonaccia acutely observes that at Loreto, the spark of devotion which Francis had always cherished towards Our Blessed Lady suddenly burst into a consuming flame which destroyed the last traces of vanity and worldliness in his soul. His subsequent conduct confirms this hypothesis. The old, facilitating Francis has disappeared forever. Instead, he is firm and unyielding in the face of the further trials to which his vocation would soon be subjected. Whence did he gain the spiritual strength? The answer lies hidden in Loreto. It would be interesting to know what thoughts filled his mind during the hours he spent in the Holy House. As he has left no record of them, we can only surmise. The other saints have visited Loreto, and from their various reactions, there is at least a clue to his sentiments of devotion. During a pilgrimage to Rome before she entered Carmel, St. Teresa of Lisieux visited Loreto. In her diary, she left a record of her impressions. In quotes, "I was overwhelmed with emotion when I realized that I was under the very roof that had sheltered the Holy Family. I gazed on the same walls our Lord had looked upon. I trod the ground once moistened by the sweat of Joseph's toil, and saw the little chamber of the Annunciation, where the Blessed Virgin had held Jesus in her arms." End quote. Thoughts such as these passed through the mind of Francis Possenti as he knelt there, motionless and silent and alone, not noticing the passing of the hours. It was now time to keep their appointment for lunch with the canon, and not without some trepidation Francis followed his brother to the canon's house. Remarking that he had already read the letter from Santi Possenti, the canon made them heartily welcome, and asked for news of the family from Spoleto. He suggested that they postpone the discussion on Francis' vocation until after lunch. A good dinner should not be ruined by serious conversation. In the meantime, he cast a quizzical yet searching glance at his nephew, a glance which took in the whole picture of a rather delicate-looking youth of 18, well-dressed, with charming manners, and an air of distinction and good breeding. In quotes, "He is probably not strong enough for the Passionists," thought the canon to himself, and decided to follow up this line of thought after dinner. When they were all at their ease, Canon Acquacoda introduced the subject. For a start, he underlined the well-known austerity of the Passionist congregation, all the more difficult for one who had come from a comfortable home and who had been used to a high standard of living. He went into further details: the frequent fasts, the indifferent food, the rigorous penances, the rising for night office, the rough, coarse habit, the sandals and bare feet, the endless privations that Francis would have to face. The canon pointed out that he knew what he was talking about. In quotes, "I once spent a few days in the Passionist monastery," he said. "I'm certain that you won't be able to put up with it, even for 2 nights. I don't like to think that this idea of yours is the result of a sudden fit of fervor. I'd like you to think seriously about this whole business, so that you won't run the risk of doing something for which you'll be sorry afterwards." End quotes. In respectful silence, Francis listened to the canon's speech. When he had finished, or at least when he had run out of reasons, Francis replied briefly that he had already prayed much and had given the matter a great deal of thought. He was determined to join the Passionists and could not possibly doubt that this was his vocation. With this, the rather difficult interview came to a conclusion, for apparently Father Aloysius did not intervene. But before they left, the kind-hearted old canon had a word with Francis. He assured him that his vocation had stood up well to the severe trial he had planned. He promised to write a full account of the interview to Santi Possenti, and much to the gratification of Francis, told him he would say a word on behalf of his vocation. The canon was as good as his word. A few days later, Sante Pacenti was astonished and disappointed that the canon, too, had failed him. In quotes, "I feel obliged to write to you," said Canon Aquacota, "to ask you to give your consent to your son's wishes, for in my opinion, his vocation shows every sign of being sincere." End quote. In the afternoon, the brothers were left to their own resources to fill in the remainder of the day as they pleased. But Francis had no inclination to patronize the amusements and sideshows which were a feature of the celebrations at Loreto. He returned to his former place in the Holy House, and remained there for the rest of the day. He quitted his post only when the basilica was being closed for the night. Francis greatly wanted to have a relic, or rather a souvenir of his visit to the Holy House. Surreptitiously, he managed to detach a piece of loose plaster from the inner wall and carried it off in triumph. When he had gleefully shown his trophy to Father Aloysius, his quick joy was quickly changed to apprehension. With a severe expression, lightened by a twinkle in his eye, the priest told Francis that it was most strictly forbidden, under pain of excommunication, to remove anything whatsoever from the Holy House. Whereupon, the crestfallen Francis had to retrace his steps, seek out the canon in charge of the basilica, and hand back his treasure. In quotes, "I think," added Father Aloysius sympathetically, "he would have given anything in the world to be allowed to keep it." End quote. Their departure from Loreto was fixed for 8 o'clock next morning, so once more they were early astir. Father Aloysius said Mass, and Francis again received Holy Communion. He remained at his prayers until the last possible minute, and it was only with some difficulty that Father Aloysius could drag him away in time to catch the coach for Sinatovia. Here they had arranged to pay a social call upon their mother's family, the Frissinotis, but the visit was not a success. At first, the relatives were delighted to see Francis. They wanted to hear about his studies, his plans for the future, his choice of career. But when they heard what his plans were, and that the only future he looked forward to was an obscure life in a remote Passionist monastery, they were at first astonished and then critical. With the freedom enjoyed by close relations, they did not mince their words. Their comments became more sarcastic and disapproving, and they took no pains to hide their attitude. The brothers felt they had outstayed their welcome, and thought it better to leave. Once safely outside the house, they exchanged meaning glances. Francis wearily shrugged his shoulders. It had been a frustrating experience, but at least the ordeal was now behind them. When they reached Moravel, one more visit had to be made before they proceeded to the Passionist monastery. Their uncle, Father John Baptiste Frescati, was guardian of the Capuchin friary in the town and had offered them hospitality for the night. He too had also had a letter from Sante Pacenti requesting him to examine Francis's vocation. The shrewd-eyed but kindly Capuchin took stock of his nephew and decided to use the same line of approach as that used in Loreto by Canon Aquacota. He painted the Passionist life in even blacker colors than before. Its rigid rule, its austerity, its penitential practices. In quotes, "The rule of the Capuchins is hard enough," he bluntly declared, "but the Passionist rule is still harder. Look," he added, taking a fold of his habit and holding out to Francis, between finger and thumb, "look, do you see this rough, coarse habit of mine? Well, the Passionist habit is rougher still." End quote. Francis did not seem a bit perturbed at the prospect. He smilingly replied that he would like to try it for himself, and that God would give him the grace to keep the rule. The travelers rested at the Capuchin friary next morning. After dinner, Father John Baptiste accompanied his two nephews to show them the way to the Passionist monastery, a short distance from the town. Thus, the final stage of the journey began, with the brown-habited, bearded Capuchin striding along in the middle, his sandaled feet rising little puffs of dust on the dry country road. On his right was the slim figure of the young Dominican, in the graceful black and white robes of his order, and on his left was Francis Pacenti, walking right out of the world he had known for all his 18 years, into the unknown world that lay behind the doors of a Passionist monastery. Take a good look at him now, for this is the last time he will be seen abroad in his present garb. The long traveling cloak was thrown back negligently off one shoulder. The carefully polished shoes were now soiled with dust. From the debonair hat perched jauntily upon his glossy, well-brushed hair to the neat flowered waistcoat and the soft silk cravat, he was still every inch Francis Pacenti. But on his face was a look of eager expectancy, for this, at last, was the beginning of a great adventure. And in his eyes was the rapt look of a young knight about to dedicate himself to the quest for the Holy Grail, for Francis Pacenti felt that he was at length coming home. He would be where Mary had wanted him to be. She had called him from the world and had pointed out the way. She had guided him when he was in danger of being lost, and had led him by strange paths to the threshold of a new life.